much do you know about artificial intelligence?
I thought it was only theoretical.
It was. 2 years ago, you remember Helsinki, the first time that a chess-playing computer ever beat a grandmaster? That was Wilczek's program. It's a learning machine, a computer that actually thinks. And it's become something of a holy grail for some of our more acquisitive colleagues in the Department of Defense.
Hello, and welcome to Discovering the X-Files, the podcast in which a newbie, that's me, takes a deep dive into the entirety of Chris Carter's creepy universe as longtime fans escort me on the journey, a journey filled with paranoid conspiracies and monsters of the week. I'm Erix Antoine, and today I'd like to welcome my dear friend Natalia Castro to the podcast. She's a longtime X-Files fan calling in from Colombia to discuss the episode Ghost in the Machine, which originally aired in the US on October 29th, 1993. It was written by Alex Ganza and Howard Gordon, and directed by Gerald Friedman. In this episode, Mulder's old partner from the Behavioral Analysis Unit asks him for help in the investigation into a murder at a software company. Mulder and Scully eventually uncover a hostile artificial intelligence which has started killing to protect itself. It's an X-Files techno thriller. And after the break, Natalia and I are going to get into it. Stick around.
Let me show you something. Smart home. From this prototype, I have access to every square foot of my house. This place is as safe as Fort Knox and as energy efficient as your average igloo.
Mr. Wilczek, is this system related to the one in your corporate building?
Variation on a theme.
In your opinion, how many people know the system well enough to override it?
Finally, the bonus question. Not many is the answer.
Could you have done it?
Of course. I designed the system. That's why you guys are here, isn't it? I'm your logical suspect.
Before we talk about this specific episode, I would like you to give me a little background information. What is your relationship to the X-Files?
So when it started airing was around the time when I discovered that I really wanted to get into filmmaking. So I remember just like every time I watch an episode, like begging, I don't know who, to make sure that the show lasted long enough for me to at least be an extra on the show. That's how intense my love for that show was. Like, this show took me down a rabbit hole of fan fiction and conspiracy theories, and it was really fun. Not that I'm like a conspiracy theory, truther or whatever. I just really liked all the stuff with Area 51 and alien abductions and all that. It was fun at the time.
You're into the mythology. Yeah, because I have had that discussion with Daniel. We've been talking about that and how, there is that sort of dividing line of fans, right? You have the fans who are all about the mythology. They're into that. And then you have the other fans who hate that and prefer the standalone episodes. And I mean, I guess that's maybe during the time that it was airing, you had that situation. And maybe now, in a retrospective sense, I don't know what the case is now. It's just that now, the way that television shows are and what we've gotten used to with the whole thing about binge watching, that people who are used to getting into a TV show are used to like an overarching arc or a mythology, or just this serialized story, which basically in the case of the X-Files, if you focus just on the mythology episodes, you're getting this sort of storyline that's developing, right?
Yeah.
And so maybe nowadays somebody who's coming to it now might be like, oh, those are actually the most interesting episodes because there's a story that's developing, whereas the standalones are just kind of like, Like they can be fine. Like this one here is a standalone, the one that we're going to
Yeah,
talk about today.
they're great standalone episodes. Like they're brilliant, but my primary interest was on the alien stuff, basically.
Your interest was the alien mythology and the conspiracy, right? The government conspiracy to cover all of that up and
Yeah.
all that stuff that's going on. So that makes total sense. And I'm just getting into it now, although over the years I have watched a handful of episodes here and there. And I will say that, like, I'm also of the opinion that the mythology stuff is more interesting because
Hmm.
that has the rich element. That's something that develops throughout the series.
It's also about the characters.
Right.
Yeah. So you get
Right.
to know Mulder really well, and you get to see how Scully kind of develops from a skeptic to um, reluctant believer, I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and so like that's basically like the I guess the what I'm curious to see as somebody who's discovering this show now is that I want to see what really ends up appealing to me because at this point because of the way that I like that stuff and I was very intrigued in the pilot episode and the Deep Throat and that stuff does intrigue me. So I do think that I'm probably going to be one of those that gravitates toward the mythology of it more than just the standalones. Okay, so we've established that you're basically a fan. You're into the mythology. I mean that's the thing. You're a true fan. You were hoping one day to be an extra. Um, and I would imagine the show did last long enough that you could have been an extra, but I assume you never had the chance, unfortunately.
Oh God, no.
So yeah, so let's talk about this episode, Ghost in the Machine, which is it's a quote unquote monster of the week episode, right? It's not a
Yes.
mythology episode. This episode, reportedly, they don't like it. They weren't too happy with it at the I can't speak for fans. Again, I'm not with, but the makers of the show and behind the scenes details, the writers, Howard Gordon, Alex Ganza, they weren't too happy. They were like, we're not really very computer literate, so I don't know if this came out exactly like I would have wanted. And and I go, but you don't really need to be that computer literate to tell this story because clearly what this is this is HAL. This is HAL in an office building instead of on a spaceship. But it's essentially just HAL. It's the computer run amok. We've seen it before in the genre. It's not really about the technology of it. I think the general concept is pretty straightforward. And yeah, I get it. They don't really delve too deeply into technological details, but they don't need to. They don't need to go into too much techno babble because it's a pretty simple idea. It's AI that's too sophisticated and gets to a point where it becomes dangerous. That's really all it is.
Yes, but what I found really like interesting watching it again is that they were talking about things that are real now that I'm not sure if they were of public knowledge or if the terms even existed back then. Intelligent homes, all that connectivity that you see in the building, it's pretty much kind of normal now.
Well,
But
yes, yes.
yeah, but yeah, so I don't know. Their concerns are interesting. I do know that, but they were pretty accurate. I mean, they were talking about machine learning, which clearly is super old, but it's so looking at the way all the graphics are presented in the
Yeah.
show, it looks a little dated, but the concepts were they're pretty modern and kind of ahead of their time, I think. Because I'm not sure if in the 90s that concept of the smart homes was that, I don't know, popular or public.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I'm not too sure either.
Yeah.
It's possible that they were already talking about it. It's possible that because they talk about not being very computer literate or whatever. But I'm sure, like any writer, when you're trying to tackle a topic and you want to be somewhat topical, you want to relate it to reality in some way, you do some research. So I'm pretty sure that they did that. I'm pretty sure that they looked into technological advances at the time, things that were being developed, things that were happening. And because you brought it up, I mean, the idea presented, the idea of smart homes, the idea of having Alexa, and Alexa basically controls your entire house, that exists now. You have that, and that's ultimately what this is. It's an operating system that controls an office building, right? Which then they want to exploit for the military wants to exploit, to make smart weapons for defense purposes, or let's be honest, for attack purposes. So that's ultimately, all of that is actually very truthful. So yeah, they go like, oh, well, we're not very computer literate. Again, you don't need to be computer literate. You just need to be somewhat literate. You need to be literate in terms of the concept, in terms of what's going on.
And it's sci-fi. I mean, you have the freedom to just create.
Sure. Yeah. And their responsibility is to kind of ground the story. So to be perfectly honest, I think they did a really good job. It's a grounded sci-fi story. Again, it's something that we've seen, it's HAL. So they didn't go too far for that. They just said, well, let's just make HAL, but let's do it in an office building. That's ultimately what it is, right down to the way they stop him in the end. It's practically when Mulder sticks that disc into the computer, you half expect the operating system to start singing Daisy, the bicycle built for two. Yeah. It's practically obviously the same scene, but it's fine. I mean, they're obviously doing that deliberately, and it is interesting. You bring up how some of the stuff, some of the graphics, the way that the technology is rendered is a little bit dated. And yes, I would say that obviously the computer monitors that you see, the way things are shown, the way like the operating system is represented by this sort of these light beams that sort of move, this graphic, this spectral wave,
Yep.
And you see little digital readouts and little lights, and this is 1993, so that's basically what that sort of computer would have looked like then. But one thing that I like about this show in general, and that I think you can pinpoint it here too, is that it is a little bit dated in the sense that when it shows technology, because it's of its time, it's not showing you futuristic stuff. It's not trying to tell you this is the future, this is now. But because it's showing that, it has a quality that actually isn't dated. Like it feels contemporary. And what dates it is the fact that it takes place in 1993. But in that case, you can look at it almost as a period piece, because it's showing you something of the time, but nothing about it is particularly of the time besides the technological aspect. The way people are dressed, or things are very subtle. There's no like music cues. The way the show is done just looks very clean and very crisp. It just has this sort of nicely minimalist style that just makes it look like a good science fiction movie. It's only dated in the sense that it's a period piece. It's a period sci-fi piece. The one thing that's interesting here also is that up until now, the episodes, whether they've been mythology episodes or Monster of the Week episodes, have had a sort of supernatural quality to them, or a really sci-fi sort of element, where whether it was an alien abduction or a serial killer who hibernates for 30 years, or
tombs. Oh my god!
Right. I mean, whatever it is, there's already the last episode, which is about a poltergeist. The thing is that up until this point, there tends to be a supernatural kind of creepy vibe to it. This is technological. So yeah, there's a sci-fi element in that it's a very advanced AI, but it's atypical in the sense that it's not about the paranormal. It's not about the paranormal. That's what I would say. And I think it's the first episode where the villain is not paranormal. It's simply technology run amok. And I know that's not the last time they'll do this, but it's not something for which the X-Files is normally characterized. Usually you think about it from a paranormal sense.
Yes,
You know,
aliens or ghosts, basically.
yeah, aliens
Yeah,
or ghosts or mutants or
or
whatever,
mute.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I really like so the machine. I think it's really interesting how it even back then the concept of um, an AI that is kind of evil, not evil, but it's I don't know when did that start because you always have the AI that's either in survival mode, which is what happened in this episode. I mean, the machine is only attacking because it's feeling attacked. That's it.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
But you also have other examples where the AI is so super logical, the only logical conclusion is to kill humans, or you have the AI like in what was it, Ex Machina, where it's essentially manipulative and seductive. And yeah, I don't know when that started.
You're right. You're right that primarily when science fiction stories focus on AI, they tend to be cautionary tales. You're right. I think that it's just that the idea of that we're giving machines too much power, we're giving them too much autonomy, and so one day, what happens when they surpass us? When they surpass us, they might decide that we are actually a danger to them.
But
And
here's
so,
okay. So
you
here's the
know,
thing. That's when I kind of I don't. Okay, so I have a little bit of a different view on that, and
sure.
that's basically if you take like concepts of machine learning, and I'm not an expert. I know like very surface level. You are essentially feeding a computer a model so that it can learn. So it's basically you teach the machine how to interpret things. So if you teach a machine, or if you teach a kid that to be violent and horrible, then the kid will probably grow up to be violent, horrible. But if you teach it to be respectful and kind, chances are the kid's gonna grow up to have a little bit of that goodness.
Yeah, that
So
makes sense.
yeah, so to me that applies to an AI. To me it doesn't have to necessarily become so super logical that humans are necessary. It could be good.
Right, right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just again like I don't have that apocalyptic view. I mean, I think that
Mm.
developments in artificial intelligence could ultimately be beneficial, but it all like I agree with you. It all depends on what you're feeding into that AI and what application you're giving that AI. So
Yes.
what we have in this situation is you have a smart home essentially,
Mm-hmm.
and it feels threatened because they want to shut down the program, which means they're going to terminate its existence. And so
Yeah.
he wants to
It
put a
just wants
stop
to
to that.
survive. Yeah.
Right. And that's totally relatable. That's something where you go, well, it's just about survival for that machine. It's not about, it just doesn't want to be shut off. But if you apply that same technology to weapons of war, you're making like
Mm.
smart missiles, smart weapons, smart drones, whatever it is, you're creating assassins essentially. So you look at what are the ethics there. You know what? That's ultimately, I mean, that's the Terminator, right? The Terminator is what Skynet, which is basically this all-purpose AI that was supposed to be for the benefit of humanity, eventually annihilating humanity when they realize, because they've got the weapons. Humanity creates the weapons, but they give the artificial intelligence the power to understand what those weapons are, and they're basically saying all these people just want to kill each other. That's
Yeah.
all they want to do, and if they kill each other, then they eventually will kill us. So let's just kill them before they kill us.
Yep.
And that's ultimately what it is. What happens with Skynet? It's like these guys
Exactly.
suck. These guys are actually dangerous. They're using this technology to destroy each other. Why don't we just destroy them before that happens, and that way we're fine? You
Yep.
know, I mean, that's how I've always interpreted it. So yeah, I completely agree that it depends how you apply the AI. So obviously, if you apply the AI for murder, you're going to create a murderous AI that will
Yeah.
ultimately murder you. But if you apply the AI for something, that's good, then that is, it's all about the application, right? So I think that that's a valid point, and But and I think that that's sort of that applies to any technological advance, because like
Yeah.
here you have the conflict, the character of what's the guy's name? The the guy who created the operating system.
Brad Wilczek. Yeah.
Brad,
I wrote it
yes,
down. I wrote it down.
yes, okay. Brad
Mhm.
Wilczek, who looks familiar. He's one of those character actors who like I've seen
He's
in a
been in
million things.
everything. He's been in
Yeah,
everything. Yeah.
he always plays a character like that. He always plays like a scientist or like he's always. But I'm pretty sure some robot killed him in some sci-fi movie at some point because he looks
Yeah. He
extremely familiar to me.
he has a nerdy look that applies to sci-fi. He's been in everything.
Yeah, he's shown
Yeah.
up in everything. And right now, I don't know what the actor's name is, and I'm too lazy to look it up. But
Yep.
yeah, so Brad Wilczek, right? I mean, that's his whole conflict, right? Because he feels like Oppenheimer, because he
Mhm.
he's talking about how Oppenheimer when he saw what happened with the bombs, he was like he wished he had never harnessed that power because
Yep.
his intention was never to use that power in such a destructive manner.
Yep.
His intention was to try to use that power for some positive application. And it's the same in Brad Wilczek's case. He designed this very complex AI system for the benefit of humanity because the idea of having a home that is completely self-sufficient, that conserves energy, that is safe, that has a good security system that protects you, from intruders or just keeps you safe and you're not, you're saving energy, all that stuff. These are all positive applications, and
Yep.
so that's his view of it. But no, of course, the military says no, no, no. But let's use that technology to create bombs that
Mhm.
seek out specific targets and they'll put a positive spin on it too. They'll be like, well, this is how we prevent uh, collateral damage. This is how we prevent civilians from dying unnecessarily. Because if we have a drone that has AI that's going to seek out specific targets, then when we go to assassinate, that Iranian general, the drone will only shoot him, and it will not attack the other people or anything. So that's ultimately they're always going to spin it that way, but obviously it doesn't matter because you're still creating a means of destruction, and
Yep.
that's what he wants. So yeah, it makes sense. I mean, it always makes sense that in these stories, even in the ones where that paint the technology as harmful, it's always about yeah, it turned out to be harmful, but the intention was not harmful.
Yep.
So it's still a cautionary tale. It's still a yes, you have the best of intentions, but you're harnessing things and you're playing God, right? That's the cliche. I mean, he's playing God, and ultimately you have to be careful because you can get to a point where maybe you lose control of what you're doing, and then
Or
it's
or you
beyond you,
have to be or you have to be super careful not to let it fall into the wrong hands. And
right?
then there's the question of which are the wrong hands. It's complicated.
Right. It's that exactly. Which are the wrong hands? Like according to whom? You know,
Yeah.
who? So that stuff's interesting, and that's why like I think the episode on a whole it does work as like a cool little sci-fi story about AI run amok. For whatever reason, they weren't 100% satisfied with it. Maybe they felt it was too derivative. I don't know, but I don't think it matters that it's derivative because the important thing is that it works and it's
Yeah.
it's sufficiently suspenseful. It's not unpredictable. I mean, you have the whole subplot going of Mulder's old buddy, who brings
Yeah.
him on, who brings him onto the case, and then he's such a fuck up that he has to sort of steal Mulder's report and pass it off as his own. Use Mulder's notes to make his
Classic.
report. Yeah, and so he's just sort of like, oh look, I'm sorry, I'm here with my hat in my hand or whatever he says, right? But like, I it's not unpredictable because it has the sort of typical horror movie cliche, like when he goes and he's like, okay, I'm going to go investigate this. And Mulder's like, no, 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 I'll go with you. No, 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 you stay. I'm going to take care of this. I'm like, okay, well, that guy's toast. And
Yeah, the
yeah,
episode had a few tropes, so that's one, right?
yeah, yeah.
Um, the other one, and this one applies to like Scully for the whole series, is how she always starts being the skeptic and trying
Mhm.
to find the scientific spin to what's happening, and then things have to happen to her for her to be more flexible in her thinking about what's happening. So it took her getting hacked to believe that there was something going on in the building with the machine.
Well, there's also, and here's the thing, what you just brought up about a trope, another trope, and at least, I mean, this is the case in the first half dozen episodes, is that she's the skeptic, and the story is always contrived in such a way that she's never, with like one very crucial exception, she's actually never there for the big reveal that would make it clear to her that what she's being skeptical about is actually true. So like it's always this thing where like she shows up just after the paranormal thing happens. So she shows up for the aftermath. Or like in this case, she's like, she's stuck in a vent, in a ventilation shaft, in an air vent, and she's battling a deadly fan. That's the action. That's the action climax of the series of the episode, that she's battling a deadly fan that's going to chop her up.
That is a massive trope from 80s action movies.
Yes, yeah, it's a little spin on the whole. I think the initial intention, looking at behind the scenes information, they initially wanted that to be in an elevator shaft, but then I guess it was going to be too costly to do that effect or that set or whatever. So they said, nah, let's just make it let's make it an air duct, and that'll be easier to shoot, easier to do. So they did it that way, but ultimately it's like, it's like you start with Die Hard, but it kind of becomes a cliche that you have like the air duct and the person like scrambling through the air duct. And so when does she show up? She shows up to save Mulder from like the kind of shady double agent, that's working in the building. So in her view, that's the real bad guy. It's like she hasn't actually, maybe she comes to understand that the technology got away from itself or whatever. But in this particular case, not paranormal. But it's just funny how she always shows up after everything went down, right? She never actually witnesses any of the creepy stuff, at least not in these first half dozen episodes or so. And it's so that's why it's funny. Okay, so you as a fan, now rewatching this episode, how does it hold up for you?
Took me a little bit to get used to. It seems like it takes its time.
Okay, the pacing.
The pacing. Yeah. I didn't remember that.
Okay.
Now they're pretty great shows, like modern shows that have that. So if you like slow stuff, like Debs is one show that had a really kind of slow pace, but a lot of things happened at the same time. So this show has that. At least this episode had it.
Okay. Yeah, I can follow that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's because the villain, the machine, because it's a contained system, so maybe it doesn't allow for a lot of action or movement. It's like in rooms. The whole episode happens in rooms, basically.
Yes. Well, I mean, the villain is technological, and as you're pointing out, it's like HAL. It's HAL. It's more of a suspense story than an action story, obviously. Even though you've got the action sequence, with Scully stuck in the vent and fighting for her life.
And it had like the ambience was more like horror than action, so the pace was still like a little bit slow, but it was great.
Yeah,
it was fun, and it fit the story very well.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it definitely has a pacing issue. Not so much an issue. It's deliberately paced. It's deliberately paced, but that also sort of gives it that feel of an old school sci-fi movie. Because it has, on top of the sophisticated quality that they bring to it, in terms of the way that they handle the storytelling, part of that is the deliberate pacing. So it is akin to something like, one of its big inspirations is 2001. 2001 would not be considered one of the more fast-paced, exciting sci-fi adventure movies.
Oh no, that's one of the slowest movies ever. Exactly. But it's great.
So it has that sort of deliberate kind of style to it. It has that minimalist style, deliberate pacing. I agree. And obviously you compare that with something more modern. Maybe for some people it's a little bit hard to really latch onto right away. But overall, I think this is an interesting episode. I enjoy it. I enjoyed it. I thought it was good. I think the writers were hard on themselves if they weren't satisfied with what they'd done. But I also like that they're self-critical because it means that they're striving always for the best possible quality. So they have maybe very high standards, exacting standards. And so if a story like this, which is pretty straightforward and I think pretty well constructed and basically logical, doesn't please them, then okay, then it means that they're going to work extra hard each time to do better stories. So I'm happy
Uh,
that they are that self-critical. I think you should be.
yeah. Do you remember, like, have you read about how if the show was popular with the first season? I don't remember.
Well, what I know is that it was popular enough, because if it hadn't been, this is the kind of thing where because of its nature, it's the sort of thing that gets canceled after a season.
Yeah.
And as I understand it, yeah, it might not have been the highest rated show, if you compare it to other Fox shows like The Simpsons or whatever. Obviously, it wasn't pulling in those kinds of ratings, but it was pulling in strong enough ratings, I guess, when compared to other genre shows of the period, like I don't know, Star Trek Deep Space Nine or whatever. I think it was operating on a higher level than those shows in terms of ratings. So,
Okay.
and it was ultimately, I think it did better in the ratings than, I mean, eventually, right, than Twin Peaks did, because Twin Peaks only lasted 2 seasons.
Yeah,
But
because it makes sense that they'd be hard on themselves if they were sort of under a presumed threat of cancellation in their first season.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't
Right.
I don't believe that I don't think they were. Certainly not at this point. I mean, it was a brand new show, and I think they had worked really hard, and Fox was really pushing it, and they were
Okay.
really working hard at like the quality of it, to try to give it a really unique sort of cinematic quality to set it apart from most shows at the time. And I
What
think that
happened to Fox? Like, I mean, Fox, like, it was like really brave making this show, and after that, what they've done with shows of that type, it's like it's puzzling. Like what happened with Firefly and Almost Human, and those little shows that they didn't even bother airing the episodes in the right order, and
right. Yeah,
the,
no, I don't know. I mean, like, what you mean, like,
yeah.
what, how did why were they like that, or
Like I mean, look, if you're gonna make a show like the X Files, you have to have like a little bit of balls, I guess, because it's not a common show. It's not a normal show. It's probably not a show that on paper seems like a show that's gonna bring a lot of people, like a lot of eyes. Then
right,
if you just and you keep a show going for what 11 no 7 seasons was the original run, seven
of
seasons.
the X Files?
Yeah. Or was it nine? It was 9 seasons. So if
Yeah,
you keep a show like that for 9 seasons, then that would probably give you like a sense of being able to be more creative, or at least more open to creative
yeah.
shows. And then what happened to Firefly and Almost Humans was like, what happened? They don't give creative shows a chance, basically.
Right. Well, I mean, what I think it is that, well, first of all, the X Files had an advantage, which is that at the time that it came, it was unique. It was something that hadn't really been done before. Certainly not in that way. Even if it was inspired by stuff from the '70s, like Kolchak the Night Stalker or whatever else. Obviously, it has this quality to it that was different. And then, you brought up yourself, they did take a risk on it because it wasn't conventional, and they tried their best to put elements into it to make it conventional. I think over the years, but ultimately, it picked up enough of a following that it became this big thing. Because they call it a cult show, but think about it. I mean, it was a few seasons into it that they made a major motion picture while it was running. So it
Yeah.
wasn't a cult hit. It was a big hit. It was a big hit series. You don't put that kind of effort for a cult show. It obviously, got a huge audience, and it made a big impact because it was different. But then, and that obviously empowers them. The network then says, okay, well, we took a chance on the X Files. That worked out. So let's put another quirky sci-fi show on and see what happens. And well, the thing is that not every show is the X-Files, and not every show captures the zeitgeist in the same way. So
Yeah.
all those other things just didn't work. I mean, those things were effectively cult shows because they just didn't get the audience that maybe they needed or deserved or whatever. And that still happens today. That's the thing. That's what makes it sort of annoying, where now we're in a situation where that shouldn't happen, and it still happens. It's like now with all the streaming services,
Yeah.
They'll take a chance on a show and they'll put out, because it's a season at a time, and then now, because they're all about having complete packages, they should be more careful with stuff like that. Like, it's really annoying, like Netflix, where they'll debut some sci-fi show, and then you'll find out, oh, it got canceled after the second season. Okay, fine, you're going to cancel it, so then do something. Like, order in abbreviated seasons just so they can wrap up the story, for God's sake. Because that way, like, people who have been invested in this, or if you want to recommend it to some, because now, like, a really good show will come. Let's say you'll watch the first season of it, and oh, it's awesome. And then it'll get canceled. And so you can't even recommend it to anybody because it's like, yeah, but it's an incomplete story, dude. You're just going to have to, you're fucked. Like, don't bother watching it because it's got no ending, And so, like, that's very annoying. And back when it was the networks, they didn't give a shit. But now that, like, you have these complete series on streaming services that people can actually binge the whole thing, they should always, even when they cancel the show, they should always say, okay, we're going to cancel it. It's over, but you have to end it you have to end it next season. We're going to give you a short season. We're going to give you 5, 6 episodes for you to wrap up the story. Just do it.
Oh, yeah.
So, at least do something so that you can have a complete story, but whatever. We're running off the rails already, but yeah. So going back to this, yeah. So it's a solid episode. It works. And I think we agree on that. I think we agree that overall it's a pretty solid episode.
It's solid.
After the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Robert Oppenheimer spent the rest of his life regretting he'd ever glimpsed an atom.
Oppenheimer may have regretted his actions, but he never denied responsibility for them.
He loved the work, Mr. Mulder. His mistake was in sharing it with an immoral government. I won't make the same mistake. I'm sorry about what happened, but there's nothing I can do.
And you talk about morality. You're afraid of the government, but you're willing to accept the risk that your machine will kill again.
Lesser of two evils.
And there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our discussion. And if you did, please subscribe to the podcast, give us a like, take a minute to write a positive review, and go ahead and spread the word on social media. The podcast is available on Anchor FM, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms. Look for the Erix Antoine Network on Facebook or on YouTube. You can also follow me on Twitter at ErixAntoineNet. And check out my film reviews on Letterboxd, if you are so inclined. I'm Erix Antoine, and I'll be back in a few days to talk about ice. Not actual ice, but rather the classic X-Files episode, which owes more than a royalty check and a half, probably, to John Carpenter's The Thing. My friend and fellow film buff Jim Laskowski from the Directors Club will be sitting down with me to talk about that, and I hope you'll join us. So until then, let's all remember that the truth is out there. See you next time.